The rain poured down like bullets on the cracked pavement outside Morrison's grocery store, turning the parking lot into a maze of puddles and scattered shopping carts. Most people hurried past the elderly woman struggling with her overflowing bags, her arthritic hands trembling as she tried to balance everything while searching for her car keys. But David Chen stopped. In his worn construction boots and paint-stained jacket, he looked nothing like the kind of person you'd expect to see helping someone load groceries into a gleaming black Mercedes. Yet there he was, gently taking the heavy bags from her arms as she fumbled with her keys in the downpour. What neither of them knew in that moment was that this simple act of kindness would change both their lives forever. Because the woman he was helping wasn't just any stranger. She was Margaret Whitmore, the CEO of Whitmore Industries, the same company where David had just been laid off 3 days earlier. But to understand how this moment would reshape everything, we need to go back to where David's story really began. 6 months ago, David Chen had been a different man. He'd wake up every morning in the small apartment he shared with his 8-year-old son Tommy, knowing that even though money was tight and the future uncertain, they had each other. Sarah, his wife, had been gone for 2 years now. Cancer had taken her just as brutally and suddenly as it takes so many good people. But David had managed to hold things together, working double shifts at the construction site, making sure Tommy never missed a meal or felt the weight of their financial struggles. Tommy was everything to David now. The boy had his mother's bright green eyes and her infectious laugh, though David noticed that laugh came less frequently these days. Kids at school had started asking why Tommy's lunch was always peanut butter sandwiches, why his shoes had duct tape holding them together, why his dad picked him up in a beat-up truck that backfired more often than it ran smoothly. David saw how his son's shoulders would slump a little more each day, how he'd gotten quieter during their evening talks. The layoffs at Whitmore Industries had come without warning. David had been working construction on their new corporate headquarters, a gleaming tower that would house hundreds of employees in luxury offices. He'd taken pride in his work, staying late to make sure every detail was perfect, even when the foreman wasn't watching. But when the project ran over budget, the company decided to cut costs by letting go of half the construction crew. David was among the first to go. No explanation, just a pink slip and instructions to clean out his locker. That night, Tommy had found his father sitting at their small kitchen table, staring at a pile of bills that seemed to grow taller every day. The electricity notice was marked final, the rent was 2 weeks overdue. And Tommy's school had sent home another letter about unpaid lunch fees. "Dad, are we going to be okay?" Tommy had asked, his small hand resting on David's shoulder. David had pulled his son close, feeling the weight of responsibility crushing down on him like the steel beams he used to lift at the construction site. "We're going to figure it out, buddy. We always do." But privately, David wasn't sure how. His savings were gone, his job prospects were dim, and winter was coming fast. He'd started selling plasma twice a week just to keep food on the table, leaving him weak and dizzy, but bringing home just enough to buy groceries and keep Tommy from going hungry. Which brings us back to that rainy afternoon outside Morrison's grocery store. David had been using his last $20 to buy the basics: bread, milk, peanut butter, and some apples that were starting to bruise, but were marked down to a price he could afford. He was loading his meager purchases into his truck when he saw the elderly woman struggling in the rain. Margaret Whitmore was 73 years old and had been the CEO of Whitmore Industries for over 4 decades. She'd built the company from a small family business into a multinational corporation worth billions. But right now, none of that mattered. Her arthritis was acting up, the rain was soaking through her expensive coat, and she couldn't manage to hold her groceries and find her keys at the same time. David didn't hesitate. He jogged over, his own shoes splashing through puddles, and gently took the bags from her hands. "Let me help you with those," he said, his voice warm despite the cold rain running down his face. Margaret looked up at him in surprise. In her world, people helped her because they wanted something, a promotion, a contract, access to her fortune. But this man in his worn work clothes, with calloused hands and kind eyes, was helping her simply because she needed help. "Oh, thank you, dear," she said, finally locating her keys. "You really don't have to. It's no trouble at all," David replied, waiting patiently as she unlocked her car. He carefully placed each bag in her back seat, making sure nothing would tip over during the drive. As Margaret slid into her driver's seat, she rolled down her window. "What's your name, young man?" "David Chen," he replied, pushing his wet hair back from his forehead. "Well, David Chen, you've just made an old woman's day considerably brighter." She reached into her purse, but David was already walking away, waving off any attempt at payment. "No need, ma'am. Just glad I could help." Margaret watched him climb into his battered truck, noting how it took 3 tries to start the engine. Something about his genuine kindness, the way he'd helped without expecting anything in return, stayed with her as she drove home to her empty mansion in the hills. That evening, Margaret did something she rarely did anymore. She called her personal assistant at home. "Janet, I need you to run a background check on someone for me, a man named David Chen." 3 days later, Margaret had a file on her desk that made her heart ache. David Chen, widowed father, recently laid off from construction work on her very own building project. Clean record, excellent work reviews, struggling to make ends meet while raising his young son alone. The kind of man her own father had been before he built the company that would make their family wealthy beyond imagination. Margaret made a decision that would surprise everyone who knew her reputation as a tough, no-nonsense businesswoman. She was going to find David Chen and offer him a job, not out of pity, but because she recognized something in him that was becoming increasingly rare in her corporate world: genuine integrity. But finding David proved more challenging than she expected. He'd moved out of his apartment 2 weeks after losing his job, unable to make the rent. The forwarding address led to a motel on the outskirts of town, and when Margaret's driver pulled into the parking lot, she felt her resolve strengthen. The Sunset Motel was the kind of place where people stayed when they had nowhere else to go. The neon sign flickered erratically, half the letters burned out. Margaret had never been in a place like this, but she walked through the rain to room 12 and knocked gently on the door. David opened it wearing the same paint-stained jacket from the grocery store, his face showing the strain of weeks of worry and sleepless nights. When he saw Margaret standing there, his expression shifted to confusion. "Ma'am, is everything all right? Do you need help with something?" Margaret smiled at his first instinct being to help, even when he was clearly the one who needed assistance. "Actually, David, I was hoping we could talk. May I come in?" David looked around the tiny motel room, embarrassed by the meager surroundings. Tommy was at the small table doing homework by the light of a single lamp, his textbook spread across the scratched surface. The boy looked up curiously at their unexpected visitor. "Tommy, this is the lady I helped at the grocery store," David explained. "Ma'am, this is my son. Please, call me Margaret," she said, extending her hand to Tommy. "And you must be the young man your father talks about." Tommy looked confused. "Dad hasn't talked about you, ma'am. We've never met before." Margaret laughed softly. "You're absolutely right. I misspoke." She turned back to David. "I actually came here to talk to you about a job opportunity." David's eyebrows raised. "A job? Ma'am, I appreciate whatever this is, but I'm not looking for charity." "Neither am I offering it," Margaret replied firmly. "I'm offering you a position because I believe you're exactly the kind of person my company needs." What Margaret didn't tell him in that moment was that she'd spent the last 3 days researching not just David's background, but the circumstances of his layoff. She'd discovered that her project manager had been cutting corners, using substandard materials, and firing the most skilled workers to inflate his own bonuses. David had been let go not because of poor performance, but because he'd been asking too many questions about safety protocols. The job Margaret offered wasn't in construction. It was in her corporate headquarters as a facilities manager overseeing building maintenance and safety. The salary was more than David had ever imagined earning, with full health benefits and a signing bonus that would allow him and Tommy to move into a proper apartment. David stared at her in disbelief. "Ma'am, I don't understand. Why would you do this for someone you barely know?" Margaret sat down on the edge of the worn motel chair, choosing her words carefully. "David, in 40 years of running a company, I've met thousands of people. Most of them want something from me: money, connections, opportunities. But you helped me in that parking lot, expecting absolutely nothing in return. That tells me more about your character than any resume ever could." Tommy looked back and forth between the adults, sensing something important was happening, but not fully understanding what. "But I don't have experience in corporate facilities management," David protested. "I'm just a construction worker." "Who knows buildings inside and out," Margaret countered. "Who understands safety better than most engineers. Who has the integrity to ask the right questions even when it might cost him his job." She paused, which, as it turns out, it did. David's face flushed as he realized what she was implying. "You know about the layoffs?" "I know about a lot of things, David, including the fact that you were fired for doing your job too well." Margaret stood up, smoothing down her coat. "The question is, are you willing to let me give you the chance to do it properly this time?" The next morning, David walked into the gleaming lobby of Whitmore Industries wearing a new suit that Margaret had arranged to be delivered to the motel. Tommy was enrolled in a private school near their new apartment, with full scholarships that Margaret had quietly arranged through one of her foundation's educational programs. Tell us in the comments, have you ever had a stranger change your life with one simple act of kindness? But David's real test came 3 weeks into his new position. During his first comprehensive safety inspection of the building, he discovered something that made his blood run cold. The electrical system in the main server room was installed incorrectly, with outdated wiring that could spark a massive fire at any moment. Worse, the emergency exits on floors 15 through 20 were blocked by construction equipment that had never been moved after the building's completion. David documented everything meticulously, taking photos and preparing a detailed report. But when he brought his findings to his immediate supervisor, he was told to ignore them. "Look, Chen," his supervisor said, leaning back in his expensive chair. "This building passed all its inspections. If you start making waves about problems that don't exist, you're going to find yourself looking for work again. Understand?" David understood perfectly. He was being told to look the other way, just like before. The difference was that now he knew hundreds of people worked in this building every day, including Margaret Whitmore herself. If something went wrong, if there was a fire or an emergency, people could die. That evening, David sat in his new apartment, watching Tommy work on his homework at their proper dining table under bright lights. His son was smiling again, laughing with friends from his new school, no longer ashamed of his lunch or his clothes. Everything Margaret had given them could disappear if David pushed this issue. But he thought about Sarah, about how she'd always told him that doing the right thing was rarely the easy thing. He thought about the trust Margaret had placed in him, how she'd hired him specifically because she believed he had integrity. The next morning, David walked past his supervisor's office and went straight to the top floor, where Margaret Whitmore's executive suite overlooked the entire city. Her assistant tried to stop him. "Mr. Chen, you can't just walk in there. Mrs. Whitmore is in a board meeting." "Then this is perfect timing," David replied, pushing open the heavy oak doors. Margaret was seated at the head of a long conference table, surrounded by a dozen executives in expensive suits. They all turned to stare as David walked in, carrying his folder of safety violations. "David?" Margaret looked surprised, but not angry. "What's wrong?" David took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would either vindicate Margaret's faith in him or end his career. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need to speak with you about some serious safety issues I've discovered in this building." One of the board members laughed dismissively. "Security, could you please escort this man out?" But Margaret held up her hand. "No, let him speak." She looked directly at David. "Tell me what you found." For the next 20 minutes, David presented his findings to the entire board. He showed them photographs of the faulty wiring, the blocked exits, the corners that had been cut during construction. His voice was steady and professional, but his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. When he finished, the room was silent. Several board members looked uncomfortable, shifting in their leather chairs. Finally, one of them spoke up. "These are serious allegations, Mrs. Whitmore. If they're true, we could be looking at millions in renovation costs." Margaret stood up slowly, her eyes never leaving David's face. "And if they're true and we do nothing, we could be looking at something far worse than money." She turned to address the entire room. "I want every department head to clear their schedules. We're going to walk through this building floor by floor, and we're going to fix every single problem Mr. Chen has identified." The board member who had tried to have David removed looked incredulous. "Margaret, surely we should have our own engineers verify these claims before we what?" Margaret's voice cut through the room like steel. "Before we risk the lives of our employees to save a few dollars?" She picked up David's report. "Mr. Chen, how long will it take to make these repairs safely?" 6 weeks if we do it right. We'll need to relocate some departments temporarily and bring in specialized electricians for the server room." "Then that's what we'll do." Margaret turned back to the board. "Meeting adjourned. I want cost estimates and contractor recommendations on my desk by tomorrow morning." As the executives filed out, many of them shooting dark looks at David, Margaret walked over to where he stood by the windows. "Do you realize what you just did?" she asked quietly. David nodded. "I probably just got fired again, but Mrs. Whitmore, I couldn't live with myself if something happened and I hadn't spoken up." Margaret smiled for the first time that morning. "David, you didn't get fired. You just proved that I was right about you." She paused, looking out at the city below. "Do you know why I really hired you? Because I helped you with your groceries? No. I hired you because in 40 years of running this company, no one has ever walked into my boardroom and risked their career to tell me something I needed to hear. That's not just integrity, David. That's leadership." 6 weeks later, Whitmore Industries reopened with a celebration that made the local news. The building was now one of the safest in the city, with state-of-the-art emergency systems and safety protocols that exceeded every regulation. But for David, the real celebration was smaller and more personal. Tommy ran up to him as he left work that evening, his new school backpack bouncing behind him. "Dad, Mrs. Whitmore said she has a surprise for us." Margaret was waiting by David's new company car, another benefit of his promotion to Director of Building Safety and Operations. She was holding a small wrapped box. "What's this?" David asked, accepting the gift with confusion. "Open it," Tommy urged, bouncing on his toes with excitement. Inside the box were 2 tickets to the city's annual Children's Hospital Charity Gala. David looked up at Margaret with questions in his eyes. "The hospital where your wife received treatment is opening a new wing next month." Margaret explained gently. They're naming it the Sarah Chen Memorial Cancer Center. The foundation I established in her honor will ensure that no family ever has to choose between medical care and financial survival. David felt his eyes fill with tears. He'd never told Margaret about Sarah's medical bills, about how they'd bankrupted the family even with insurance, about how Sarah had wanted to stop treatment to save money, but David had convinced her to keep fighting. How did you... The same way I learned that you've been donating your plasma to help pay for Tommy's school lunches, Margaret replied softly. The same way I learned that you've been sleeping in your truck some nights to save money on the motel room. Did you really think I'd offer someone a job this important without learning everything about who they really are? Tommy looked up at his father, understanding more than David realized. Dad, you don't have to donate your blood anymore, right? Because now we have enough money? David knelt down to his son's level, pulling him into a tight hug. That's right, buddy. We're going to be just fine. But Margaret wasn't finished. David, there's one more thing. She handed him an envelope. The board voted unanimously yesterday. We want to offer you a position as Vice President of Operations. Your salary would triple, and you'd oversee safety protocols for all of our properties nationwide. David opened the envelope, his hand shaking as he read the offer letter. It was more money than he'd dreamed of earning in his entire lifetime. Mrs. Whitmore, I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it, she replied. But first, I want you to know something. That day in the parking lot, when you helped me with my groceries, you saved my life in a way you'll never understand. She paused, looking at both David and Tommy with genuine warmth. I'd been thinking about retiring, about selling the company. I was tired of dealing with people who only saw dollar signs when they looked at me. But you reminded me that there are still good people in this world, people worth fighting for. Share in the comments if you've ever experienced a moment that changed everything for your family. As Margaret walked to her car, David called after her. Mrs. Whitmore, wait. She turned back, raising an eyebrow. Why didn't you tell me who you were that day at the grocery store? Margaret smiled, the same genuine smile she'd given him in that rainy parking lot 6 months ago. Because, David, the most important things we do for each other happen when no one is watching, when there's nothing to gain, and when we're just one human being helping another. 3 years later, David stood at the podium of the city's largest auditorium, addressing a crowd of business leaders and community members at the annual Ethics in Business Conference. His speech was about corporate responsibility, about the importance of putting people before profits, and about how one act of kindness can create ripples that change entire communities. In the front row sat Margaret Whitmore, now retired but still actively involved in the foundation that bore Sarah's name. Next to her was Tommy, now 11 years old and thriving in his advanced programs at the private academy where he'd received a full scholarship based on his academic merit. People often ask me, David said to the audience, what it means to be successful. I used to think success was about having enough money to pay the bills, about providing for your family, about climbing some imaginary ladder that gets taller every time you reach the next rung. He paused, looking directly at Margaret and Tommy. But I learned something important from a woman who taught me that success isn't about what you have. It's about the moment you choose to help someone who can do nothing for you in return. It's about the courage to do what's right, even when it costs you everything you think you need. The audience applauded, but David wasn't finished. That rainy day in the parking lot, I thought I was just helping an elderly woman with her groceries. I had no idea she was the CEO of a major corporation. I had no idea that simple act would change my life. But here's what I want you to understand. It wouldn't have mattered if she'd been the CEO or a homeless woman or anyone in between. We help each other not because of who people are, but because of who we choose to be. After the conference, as David drove home to the house he and Tommy now owned in a safe neighborhood with good schools, he thought about the conversation he'd had with his son that morning. "Dad," Tommy had asked over breakfast, "do you ever miss the old days, when it was just us in the little apartment and we didn't have much money?" David had considered the question seriously. "I miss some things about those days, Tommy. I miss how close we were when we only had each other, but I don't miss worrying about whether we'd have enough food or whether I could keep you safe and healthy." "I remember being scared sometimes," Tommy admitted, "but I was never scared when you were there. And you never have to be scared about those things again," David had promised. "But Tommy, I want you to remember something important. Having more doesn't make us better than people who have less. It just means we have more responsibility to help." Would you have done the same thing David did when he discovered those safety violations? Tell us in the comments what you think. Now, as David pulled into his driveway, he saw Margaret's car parked outside. She visited every few weeks, usually bearing gifts for Tommy or updates about the foundation, but tonight felt different. He found her in the backyard with Tommy, pushing him on the swing set David had built last summer. She looked up as he approached, her face serious. "David, we need to talk." Tommy jumped off the swing. "I'm going inside to do homework," he announced, clearly sensing adult conversation coming. When they were alone, Margaret turned to David with an expression he'd never seen before, uncertainty mixed with hope. "The board wants to make you CEO," she said without preamble. David felt his knees go weak. "What?" "I'm recommending you as my replacement when I step down next year. You've transformed not just our safety protocols, but our entire corporate culture. Productivity is up, employee satisfaction is at an all-time high, and we've become the gold standard for ethical business practices in our industry." David sat heavily on Tommy's swing, trying to process what she was saying. "Margaret, I'm not qualified to run a billion-dollar company. I'm a construction worker who learned to read spreadsheets." "You're a man who put the safety of hundreds of employees ahead of his own job security," she countered. "You're someone who sees potential in people others overlook. You've hired more single parents, veterans, and formerly homeless individuals than any executive in the company's history, and every single one of them has exceeded expectations." She sat on the swing next to him, something the old Margaret Whitmore never would have done. "David, I've been watching you for 3 years. You don't manage through fear or intimidation. You don't make decisions based on quarterly profits alone. You understand that a company is only as strong as the people who work there, and people work best when they feel valued and safe." "But the board, they barely tolerated me when I was just facilities manager." Margaret laughed. "The board has seen our stock price double since you implemented your employee wellness programs. They've seen our safety record become the envy of every company in the industry. They've seen talent retention rates that their consultants said were impossible to achieve." She stood up, pacing slightly as her excitement built. "More importantly, they've seen something they never expected to see in corporate America. A leader who makes decisions based on conscience rather than just profit margins, and who somehow manages to achieve both." David thought about all the changes he'd implemented over the past 3 years. The on-site childcare center for single parents, the mental health counseling services, the program that hired and trained individuals transitioning out of homelessness, the emergency fund for employees facing medical crises. Each initiative had been a hard sell to the board, but each had ultimately improved both employee welfare and company performance. I need time to think about this, David said finally. Take all the time you need. But David, remember something. You didn't ask for any of the opportunities you've been given. You just tried to do the right thing at every step. This is just the next step in the same journey. That evening, David sat in Tommy's room as his son got ready for bed. The room was decorated with posters of astronauts and engineers, dreams that seemed actually achievable now that Tommy had access to the best education and unlimited opportunities. Dad, can I ask you something? Always. Do you think Mom would be proud of us? David felt his throat tighten. It had been over 4 years since Sarah's death, but moments like these still caught him off guard. I think your mom would be amazed by the man you're becoming, Tommy. You're kind to kids at school who don't have much, just like she taught us to be. You work hard and dream big, and you never forget where we came from. What about you, Dad? Do you think she'd be proud of you? David tucked the blanket around his son's shoulders. Considering the question carefully, I think your mom would be proud that we never gave up on each other. That when life got hard, we got stronger together. And I think she'd be proud that we learned to help other families the way people helped us when we needed it most. Tommy smiled sleepily. I think she'd be proud of Mrs. Margaret, too, for seeing how good you are when nobody else did. 6 months later, David stood in the same boardroom where he'd once risked his career to report safety violations. But this time, he was being introduced as the new CEO of Whitmore Industries. Margaret sat in the audience, beaming with pride as David delivered his first address to the company's leadership team. When I started working here, David began, I was just a man trying to provide for his son, hoping to do honest work and make an honest living. I never imagined I'd be standing here today asking you to trust me to lead this company into the future. He paused, looking around the room at faces that ranged from supportive to skeptical. But I want you to know something about my vision for Whitmore Industries. Success isn't just about profit margins or market share. Success is about creating a company where every employee can thrive, where every decision is made with integrity, and where we never forget that our greatest asset is the people who choose to work here. The room was silent, waiting for more. I'm not asking you to take a leap of faith based on my resume or my business degree because I don't have one. I'm asking you to trust me based on my track record of putting people first and somehow, miraculously, watching everything else fall into place. After the meeting, Margaret walked with David to his new office. The same office where she'd made decisions affecting thousands of employees for over 4 decades. Any regrets? She asked. David looked out the window at the city below, thinking about the construction workers on the streets, the single parents dropping their kids off at school, the people just trying to make it through another day with dignity and hope. None, he said firmly. But Margaret, I want you to promise me something. What's that? Promise me you'll keep an eye on me. If I ever start making decisions based on greed instead of conscience, if I ever forget what it felt like to count out quarters for Tommy's lunch money, I want you to remind me. Margaret smiled, the same genuine smile that had started everything. David, something tells me that's one promise I'll never have to keep. 5 years have passed since that rainy day in the grocery store parking lot. Tommy is now 16, captain of his school's robotics team, and headed to MIT on a full engineering scholarship that he earned through his own merit and hard work. David has led Whitmore Industries to become one of the most respected companies in the country. Known not just for its financial success, but for its revolutionary approach to employee welfare and corporate responsibility. But perhaps the most meaningful measure of success is the foundation that bears Sarah's name. It has now helped over 2,000 families facing medical bankruptcy, provided scholarships to hundreds of children from low-income households, and created job training programs that have transformed entire communities. Every year, on the anniversary of that rainy day, David returns to Morrison's grocery store. He doesn't shop there anymore. His neighborhood has much nicer stores, but he goes back to remember. Sometimes he helps elderly customers with their groceries. Sometimes he pays for a struggling parent's cart full of food, always without fanfare or recognition. Because David learned something that rainy afternoon that changed everything. We never know whose life we might change with one simple act of kindness. We never know if the person we help today might be the one who helps us tomorrow. But more importantly, we don't help others because of what they might do for us. We help because of who we choose to be when nobody is watching. The truth is, kindness isn't about the recipient. It's about the decision we make in that split second when we see someone in need to be the kind of person who steps forward instead of walking past. It's about recognizing that we're all just trying to make it through this life with as much dignity and hope as possible. And sometimes we all need someone to help carry the load. Margaret Whitmore learned that lesson from a construction worker in a parking lot. David Chen learned that lesson from a mother dying too young, teaching him that love means staying when things get impossible. Tommy learned that lesson from watching his father choose integrity over comfort again and again. But the most beautiful part of their story isn't the success or the money or the recognition. It's the ripple effect of kindness that continues to spread outward, touching lives they'll never know about, inspiring acts of generosity in people they'll never meet. Because that's what real success looks like. Not a destination you reach, but a legacy you leave. Not what you accumulate, but what you give away. Not who you become when everyone is watching, but who you choose to be when no one is looking, and there's nothing to gain except the knowledge that you helped another human being carry their burden for a little while. Family isn't just about blood. It's about who chooses to stay when life gets hard. Success isn't just about achievement. It's about lifting others up as you climb. And sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin with the most ordinary act of kindness between two strangers in a parking lot on a rainy day. Subscribe for more powerful stories like this, and click on the video on the screen to watch the next one with a twist so powerful you'll never forget it.